for another afternoon of amazing events. We are glad to introduce our next keynote. Karl Kapp, who has a doctorate in education, is a full professor of instructional technology at Bloomberg University in Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania. He teaches subjects related to games, gamification, and learning technologies. Karl is the director of Bloomsburg's Institute for Interactive Technologies, which works with organizations to create interactive instruction, including games and simulations. Karl has authored or co-authored 6 books, including The Gamification of Learning and Instruction and its accompanying how-to book, The Gamification of Learning Instruction Field Book, as well as the book Learning in 3D about virtual worlds. Karl has served as a co-principal investigator in 2 National Science Foundation grants related to games and simulations and serves as an external evaluator on a 3rd game-related NSF grant. Karl is the author of several lynda.com courses, including The Gamification of Learning. He is co-founder of the educational game company 2klearning.com, founder of the educational consulting firm The Wisdom Learning Group, and a TEDx speaker and an international presenter who travels the world speaking on the convergence of games and learning. Karl's work explores the research, theoretical foundations, and application of effective game-based learning. You can follow his widely read blog at karlkapp.com/capnotes. Karl will take questions at the end. Everyone, please help me welcome Karl Kapp.
Thanks, everybody. Absolute pleasure to be here. I always enjoy coming in World and talking to everyone and seeing how everyone is doing. And talking a little bit, combining my favorite things, which is virtual worlds, which was my 3D book, and gamification. So this is just a pleasure. Today I'm in Switzerland. It's pretty much 10 o'clock at night, so I'm excited to be here and excited to be talking to everyone. So this first slide I have is a little bit about myself, which I don't think I need to do any more on, so I'm just going to skip right over that. I want you to know that my slides and other information are on my blog, so you can certainly go there, karlkapp.com, and underneath my blog, I have underneath my website, I have insights, and underneath there is my blog. I didn't make it very intuitive. But today I want to talk about gamification. And so the first question is, what is gamification? And I actually define 2 different types of gamification. So the first type of gamification that I define is what I call structural gamification. And structural gamification is basically adding game elements such as points, badges, and leaderboards to instruction without changing the instruction at all. So for example, you watch a video and you earn some points, or you answer some multiple choice questions and you get a badge. So it's adding a structure of games around the game itself, which is very valuable and can be very helpful. But another type of gamification that I define, and one I think is more applicable to virtual worlds, is the concept of what I call content gamification. And content gamification is the use of game thinking to alter content to make the content itself more game-like. And that's where you do things such as adding challenge, adding story, characters, things that I believe make games very rich and engaging from an instructional perspective. So if we think about the 2 types of gamification, often people will ask me, they'll say, Karl, why use gamification? why use games or game type elements in a virtual world? And I think there are actually a number of reasons to do that. And I want to talk a little bit about those reasons in the presentation that we're doing today. So one of the reasons why is back to the tradition. So what happens is most people say the gold standard of training is lecture-based instruction. And I would say, why use lectures for learning? It turns out that lectures are actually not a great tool for learning in lots of situations. Now, don't get me wrong. For some situations, lectures can be great for learning, but not for all situations. And so let's take a look at some of the situations where learning works well or it doesn't work well. So for example, when we think about virtual worlds, lectures are not effective for fostering higher ordered thinking, problem solving. Those types of items are not always well versed for a virtual world. So if we look at the research behind using lectures for instruction, we find out that a large portion of lectures, sometimes up to 78%, is spent in passive thoughts or irrelevant thoughts about the lecture. Sometimes thinking seriously about the results of the lecture are only approximately 1%. So people are not focusing on a lecture in terms of higher order thinking skills. Now, that doesn't mean we throw away all lectures. Lectures can be valuable for conveying knowledge, for creating awareness, for helping us understand declarative knowledge or conceptual knowledge, but not always for understanding higher levels of knowledge. And it turns out, interestingly, that instruction with games actually yields higher gains in learning and retention than traditional instruction. And here's some information from a woman named Tracy Sitzman, who did a meta-analysis, which is a study of studies, and she looked at traditional non-engaging instruction, lecture-based, versus declarative knowledge, procedural knowledge, and retention, and found them all to be higher. Now, I'm a little I don't know that the numbers are exactly correct. You know, is it really 11% or is it 12%? Is it 14% or 20%? I don't know. But I do know that the research clearly indicates, and this has been backed by some other researchers as well, that lectures can be higher, games can be higher than lectures, like 17%, or higher than discussion. And to me, the ideal environment for engagement, for content-based gamification, is a world that allows you to engage with each other very easily. And so when we look at the information about lectures and we look at the information about instruction, we know for one thing for sure is that it's not really the game, it's not the points or the badges that make the instruction better than a lecture, it's the engagement, it's the activity. And you take something like a virtual world, and a virtual world allows lots of different activities, which we'll talk about through the presentation. And there's also been some really interesting research about interactivity through virtual worlds and through STEM education in general. So for example, there has been a meta-analysis, which again is a study of studies, that found that without interactive learning, students are 6% more likely to fail. And that if you have interactive instruction, students are more likely, 6% average examination scores, and 1.5 times more likely to fail if you don't have an interactive learning experience. And something like Second Life or any virtual world provides a really nice interactive engagement. In fact, I believe that virtual worlds are the ideal environment for engagement. They, if we use them correctly, will allow us to be highly engaged with students. The first experience I ever had, however, with the virtual world is I came in, I sat down on a virtual chair, and we had this virtual classroom, and I thought, why not have me engaged in some kind of activity? And most people who are designing effective and engaging worlds know this. They know that engagement comes from these experiences. I always say, don't think of a virtual world as a classroom. Think of a virtual world as a field trip. And if we look at the research about games, we can find that games actually promote pro-social behavior. So one of the games that has been researched is called Darfur is Dying. And that's a game about raising awareness for the Darfurian people. And in the game, you choose an avatar, a character that you play in the game. And you can choose anyone from Rahman, who's age 30, all the way to Dang, who's age 10. And as you play your character, you find some unfortunate realities. You're trying to get away from the terrorists. And it's really difficult, and lots of times you don't make it and you go through all of your characters. But there was some research that said, is playing the game Darfur is Dying better in terms of having people wanting to help other people than simply reading text about the message? And it turns out in an experiment that playing the game Darfur is Dying resulted in greater willingness to help the Darfurian people than reading a text or that conveyed the same information. So playing the game actually made people more willing to help the Darfurian people rather than simply reading a text about it. They did a second experiment, and they found that playing the game Darfur Dying resulted in greater role taking and greater willingness to help than either just watching the game or reading the game. So that immersive experience is what helped the people more effectively empathize with the Darfurian people. And again, an environment, a virtual 3D world allows that. Now, people say, well, that's just one experiment, Dr. Kapp. That's great, but is there more evidence? And there actually is a lot of evidence that immersing people in pro-social behavior games and activities virtually will allow them to become or will provide them with role models and help them to become more pro-social. So here's an example of 3 games. One is called Lemmings, where you help guide the lemmings through an obstacle course to safety. One game is Tetris. That was the neutral game. So Lemmings is the pro-social game. Tetris is the neutral game. And the third game was called Lamers, which was the antisocial game. So you actually killed the Lamers, which, you blew them up or exploded them. That's antisocial. And then they did this experiment where the researcher had the subject play the game for about 15 minutes. So, for example, they played Lamers for 15 minutes, and then the researcher did a classic experiment to find out whether or not people would help. They actually spilled the pencils, and then they observed whether or not the subject who was playing the game helped to pick up the pencils. Now, I always joke that when I tell this information to my current students, I have to explain to them what a pencil is and how a pencil works. But we all know in this environment, what a pencil is. So in the first experiment, they played the game Lamers. They spilled the pencil, and they found out that 28% of the people in the experiment actually helped to pick up pencils. So about 1/4 of the people helped to pick up pencils, even though they had just played a very violent, non-social game. Now, they repeated that experiment with the game Tetris, which was a neutral game. It's not violent, but it's not pro-social. With Tetris, they found out that more people helped to pick up pencils, approximately 33%. So an increase, but not a dramatic number. And then they took the pro-social game, did the same experiment. The researcher walked in after about 15 minutes, quote unquote, accidentally knocked over the pencils. And then they found that with the pro-social behavior, 67% of the individuals actually helped to pick up pencils. So what does this mean? This means that pro-social games encourage pro-social behavior. Pro-social activities that you could do in a virtual world would help engender pro-social activities outside of the virtual world. And there's actually been a number of experiments where activities inside the virtual world or the metasphere actually translate outside of the virtual world. And then, so the natural question is always, well, if this is good for pro-social, is it also, is the negative part of it true as well? Would a negative in-world experience have a negative outside of the world experience? And I would have to say, yes, there's some evidence to support negative activities inside a virtual world or inside a game will result in negative activities outside. So my argument is, why don't we take these pro-social activities and why don't we leverage them inside of our virtual worlds? So here's another experiment that I want to talk to you about. So the researchers thought, well, maybe that game Lemmings was a great experience, right? A great pro-social game. So let's use another game. So they repeated the experiment with something called City Crisis. And this is a game where you fly a helicopter around and rescue people from burning buildings. Now, it's not a city anyone would want to live in because every building is on fire. So it's a crazy city. And then they thought, well, maybe just picking up pencils is not the right experience, right? It's very low key. Why don't we have a male researcher come in, grab the female researcher and say, where have you been? I've been looking for you all day. Come with me right now. And then they wanted to see, would the participant in the study intervene either verbally or physically? And again, they had people play the antisocial game, and when they played the antisocial game, they had about 22% intervene. Now, in this experiment, they did not use a neutral. There was no Tetris. It was just the social and the antisocial. And when they did the social game, they found that more, 56% in fact, actually intervened. So when the male researcher came in and grabbed the female researcher, 56% of those who played the pro-social game intervened. So if we think about gamification, and we think about gamification in virtual worlds, and we think about content gamification, which is crafting an experience in that world using game elements such as goals and challenge and feedback, we can influence our learners to behave in positive manners by giving them the positive experience. So I believe that gamification in virtual worlds is really powerful in that particular way, and is something that we should think about. Now, another powerful tool that we know about gamification and games in general is that games must be embedded into the curriculum for effective learning to occur. So lots of times in a virtual world experience, the best way to craft it is to tell the learner what they're going to be experiencing in the virtual world and actually what they should be learning. So we're going to go explore a virtual molecule, and what I want you to learn is the relationship of all the elements of the molecule to one another, and then let them go and experience that molecule. And then at the end, what we need to do is we need to debrief the learners. We need to say, look, this is what you've experienced. Give us your feedback. There is actually some research out of Harvard that says that there's no learning without reflection. And this three-part system, which is teach and talk about what will be learned, explore the virtual world, and then debrief about what was learned, is a very effective methodology to enforce the learning, to make sure that the learning has occurred. Now, we can't make somebody learn something. What we simply do is craft the environment in which they are able to learn. And using this three-part system of introducing the content, allowing the learner to explore the virtual world, and then debriefing them on the content is a really good way to ensure that learning will occur within the virtual world. Now, when we think about all of the elements of virtual worlds and we map that onto games, because again, a virtual world doesn't have a goal per se, which is what is the difference between play and a game. So if we're splashing around the pool, we're playing, we're having a good time, that's just play. But if I say to you, let's race from this side to that side, all of a sudden it's a game. There are rules. There are objectives. There are an outcome that can be measured by anyone. There are boundaries. For example, if I say to you, I'm going to race you from one end of the pool to the next end of the pool, you can't get out and run, right? That's against the rules. That's outside of the boundaries. So virtual worlds typically don't have a lot of rules, maybe physics, although those rules can be broken. But when we gamify a virtual world experience, we add rules, challenges, and goals to that particular experience. And now we've changed it from just a virtual world where people can play to a meaningful, in my language, gamified experience where there are certain things that would need to happen. So when we think about virtual worlds and what happens in virtual worlds, one of the things I think that's important is that games, and I believe virtual worlds, are more effective when there's multiple sessions involved. So the more times we have a learner come into the virtual world and experience the learning outcomes we want them to experience, the more they're actually going to learn. So there's some research by, again, this is a meta-analysis, so it's a study of studies. And I believe this was of 39 different studies, and this is done by Reuters and a bunch of others back in 2013. And they found that for conventional instruction versus a game, that conventional instruction for a one-off is better than a game-based session. If you test people immediately after the game and immediately after traditional instruction, the traditional instruction is equal to or better than the game-based experience. However, if you give an individual multiple sessions and then do that same experiment and multiple sessions of traditional instruction, the multiple sessions of the game are far more impactful, and it's actually deeper and richer learning. So virtual worlds, the definition is they're perpetual virtual worlds. So you can come into a virtual world time and time again. And it's one of the most effective learning devices that we have, is letting learners come in to virtual worlds again and again and again. So one of the things that I would argue, if we talk about gamification, which is adding game elements to instruction, is that we should craft experiences in the virtual world from a gamification perspective that encourages the learners to come back again and again. So maybe they come back to that giant molecule, maybe they come back to a tsunami, maybe they come back to conflict resolution, maybe they come back to learning a language. Whatever it happens to be from a subject area is really valuable when experienced multiple times. So think about developing multiple experiences, almost like if you think about a virtual world experience and you parallel it to a game. One of the elements of a game is the element of levels, right? You level up when you play a game. When you design a virtual world experience, can you create levels so that when a learner comes in today, they experience one level of interactivity, one level of learning, they achieve one learning goal, maybe it's a enabling objective. The next time they come in the world, it's a different goal, but it's also an enabling objective. And a series of enabling objectives, 3 or 4 of those, leads to the terminal objective, what you want them to learn. But you've scaffolded that content with different levels of learning. And I think that's an important element from games that we can add to the virtual world. So we can also look at virtual worlds from another perspective and look at games from another perspective. And we find that games are more effective than traditional instruction when the players work in groups. So there's collaboration, there's group work, there's group activity. I don't think there's a more social, group-oriented technology to me than something like Second Life or a virtual world. It doesn't have to be Second Life, any kind of virtual world. And why do I say that? Well, certainly we have collaborative text-based tools. Certainly we have collaborative video-based tools. Certainly we have all kinds of collaborative tools at our disposal. But what makes, to me, a virtual world different is that we can all be in the same place at the same time, having the same experience. So the difference, for example, if we're video Skyping, right? So we're talking to each other over Skype. You can clearly see that I'm in one location and you're in another location, and we're carrying on this video conversation. But there's that distance between us that doesn't exist if we're both in the same space, the same place in a virtual world. So when I join a colleague or a group of colleagues in a virtual world experience, we're in the same place doing the same thing. If I join a group on Skype, we're not in the same place. So I think one of the really valuable elements of a virtual world is the fact that we can be at the same place at the same time. And the research is pretty clear about this. And if you look at games like, for example, World of Warcraft, which is not much different from an avatar collaborative experience as most virtual worlds, when we look at the research, we find that with serious games, learners playing individually and playing in a group learn more, but those in the group learn even more. So if you take traditional instruction and game-based instruction wins with multiple sessions. But if you take game-based instruction, one player, one person having an individual experience versus a group of people having a group experience, the group experience trumps the individual experience. The reason is because people will then talk about that experience, both in world and out of world. And they'll say, hey, I saw that you got that information really quickly. How did you do that? Or somebody says, what was the secret that you used to figure this out? Or tell me why you thought that was the wrong answer. So you get this dialogue, and oftentimes you get the reflection like, well, why did Karl do that? And you would think about it for a while, and then you say, I'm just going to ask him, Karl, why did you do that, right? And so you get that kind of information and content from the virtual world experience. So virtual worlds, by the essence of them being collaborative and being social, drive social learning. So if you think about the social aspects of a game like Call of Duty, where people are talking to each other about, hey, duck around here, go around this corner, don't do this, do that. And the results of those types of experiences, we know that they're more powerful than individual experiences. And we know that any tool that allows us to collaborate in the same place at the same time is really powerful from that perspective. And so we add the game element of collaboration, collaborating in the same space, to a virtual world space, and we can get, I think, some really dramatic learning outcomes. So if we also dive deeply into virtual worlds, we say, what elements in the virtual world lead to learning? What parts of virtual worlds can help people become better learners? Or more effectively, is what parts of virtual worlds can we create the experience so that the learning is more rich? What is it about virtual worlds, like games, that allow us to do that? And I think there's a number of things that we can do. And I think one of the first things that we need to think about when we create these virtual worlds, learning experience, is challenge. Too often in learning experiences, we choose not to challenge the learner as much as we could. Oftentimes we even start out with learning objectives, and learning objectives aren't challenging to the learner, right? You will learn 3 facts about the Battle of Gettysburg, right? Or you will learn 3 facts that led to the start of World War II, or something like that. And that kind of turns the learner off right away. But what if we started instead with the challenge? Okay, you were in the middle of Berlin, and you need to figure out what caused World War II. Or you're in the middle of the Bolshevik Revolution, and you need to figure out what you're fighting for. Starting with a challenge piques learner curiosity. And we know from the research that individuals learn most effectively when they know they don't know something. So when we're crafting these virtual world environments, can we craft a situation where the learner comes in and goes, oh, I don't know what to do. I don't know the answer. Now, I'm not saying, and some people misinterpret this, I'm not saying we totally leave them wide open. We know from the research on constructivism that giving a learner a blank slate and saying go doesn't work. But we do know that adding steps, scaffolding, and help in an unstructured problem motivates the learner more than didactically feeding them information. So by providing a challenge, we can really excite the learner and have them work towards solving whatever problem we happen to craft. So I would say that one of the elements we can borrow from games and put into a virtual world is the element of challenge. Let's challenge our learners in the virtual world. Now, another interesting element of virtual worlds that I would say comes naturally with the virtual world is the perspective. It turns out the third-person perspective of being able to look over our own avatar's shoulder, and there's a lot of research on crafting an avatar in the sense of agency and things like that. I'm not going to talk about that now, but creating an avatar and then watching what happens to the avatar is a really effective method of learning. In fact, the research shows that experiencing something in third person actually leads to higher level learning than experiencing something in first person, because you have one step removed. You're a little bit objective in observing the behavior of the avatar, and so you can draw and reflect on more conclusions. And I found this quote from Ben Casey that says, basically, viewing oneself as acting in a movie or a play, and I'll add, or in a virtual world is not merely fantasy or indulgence, but it's fundamental to how people work out who it is they are and who it is they may become. So if we want our learners to have experiences in the virtual world and reflect on those experiences, having them look over their own shoulder, their own avatar, conducting an activity is a really powerful way to get them to learn about themselves and the proper behavior and all those kind of things. And here's an example. There was really interesting research done with individuals. They broke them into two groups. One group, this is a virtual experience. One group they had fly a virtual helicopter, and then they broke that group into two. Half the people that flew the helicopter were looking for a boy who needed insulin, and half were just sightseeing. And the other half, so they broke this group in two. One half was a helicopter. The other half were superheroes, and they flew around this virtual world. Some were flying around just sightseeing, and some were flying around looking for a boy who needed insulin. And afterwards, they did the same experiment. So after they came out of this virtual experience, the researcher dropped pencils again. Every single person in the superhero group helped to pick up pencils. Every single one. Not so in the helicopter group. And every single one in the superhero group picked them up faster. So even though helicopter people did pick up, some picked up, not as fast as the superhero group. So the researchers concluded that being a superhero comes with certain requirements, right? Helping other people. And that having that experience in the virtual world actually carried over to the physical world when they spilled those pencils. Now, it doesn't carry over very long, like within 15 to 20 minutes. So I don't know about an hour or 2 hours or the next day if they still helped everybody pick up pencils. But for that brief period when they first came out of the virtual world, they were doing that. So what this points to is characters, the importance of your own avatar and your own character, and watching it perform activities and actions can really help you learn what you need to learn in terms of your outcomes within the virtual world. Again, it's gamification. And if we look at other research, we can see that we've always wanted to be characters, right? As soon as the internet came alive, we used, smiley faces, and we used, 2D avatars, and then 3D avatars, and then taller 3D avatars, right? We've always wanted to have social models. And social models, the research is pretty clear. Bandura did lots of research on this and found that we learn by modeling the behavior of others. Or in the case of a virtual world, we can learn by modeling our own behavior. It's a little meta, but I think it's pretty cool to think about how that can be done. And it also turns out from the research that the characters don't have to be that realistic. So these anthropomorphic agents or avatars, even when they have limited functionality and adaptability, are really influential. So now imagine where the character's lips are moving, it's gesturing, it looks a little bit like us or how we want to look, and all of a sudden it is having a large influence on how we behave, which again is, I think, a really important aspect of virtual learning. Now, another important aspect, I think, is the aspect of story. Because story is also driving or can drive lots of games. And good games are structured around good stories. And it turns out stories are really, really good for humans for conveying factual knowledge and for vicariously creating experiences. So we know from the research, again, that it's pretty interesting that stories are more effective for remembering facts than when the facts are in a bulleted list. I always say bullets don't kill people, bulleted lists kill people, right? So if we craft a story, which we can easily do with visuals and with experience in a virtual world, that story can really be effective. So I think that's something that we need to think about as we're crafting these virtual world experiences. And in fact, people rate legal arguments more convincing when they build them into a narrative rather than building them on legal precedent. So that also is really kind of interesting thing. So stories are really powerful tools and something I believe can be crafted into a virtual world to give people those really neat experiences. Another really interesting thing about stories is that they did some research. They put some people under an MRI to measure their brain activity. And then they had those people read a story. And the interesting thing is when they read the story, the area of their brain related to that particular area of the story lit up. So if they read about problem solving, the area in the brain that dealt with problem solving lit up. When they read about jogging, the area of their brain about that is activated when you think about jogging. When you actually jog was lit up. So it turns out that stories actually give us this vicarious practice of an experience. And if you think about, Olympic athletes, they kind of go through this story in their head about how they're going to perform. They're rehearsing in their head so they get it right. Well, why not, from an instructional standpoint, allow people to rehearse stories and other elements, experiences through stories? And why not craft a high fidelity story-based experience in the virtual world? That's using what I call content gamification, changing the content that you're teaching to be more game-like itself. So if we put all this together, let's take a look at what we can take away from this discussion. So one is, if you're going to create a virtual world experience, you're going to gamify it, create a challenge. Challenge the learners to do something, whether it's to work together to accomplish a goal, whether it's to figure out a mystery, whether it's to solve why this war was started, whether it's to learn another language. Give them a challenge. Like, so for example, if you're teaching another language, challenge them to make an appointment or a reservation at a restaurant in a foreign language. Give them something, a meaningful challenge. Scavenger hunts are a good example, as someone had indicated. Second is, use the virtual world environment to tell a story. Involve the learner in a story so the learner feels that they're part of that experience, because stories are rich ways to convey knowledge, understand knowledge, and experience knowledge. Also, think about the avatar. An avatar is an important element in the virtual world. Don't let the avatar creation, the avatar interaction, the avatar dress be incongruent with the experience. If you're teaching about firefighting, have everybody dress up as a firefighter. If you're teaching about accounting, have everybody dressed, in khaki pants and a blue shirt, right? Put people in the experience with their avatar. Next, third person is important, so encourage that, talk about that. Also, virtual worlds, I believe, are more effective than traditional instruction when you have the learners or players work in groups. Have them work in groups. It really can be successful. And it also builds the learning experience. Don't forget to embed multiple learning experiences in the virtual world. It's not a one and done. You need to come into the virtual world a few times. You need to reduce the cognitive overhead of figuring out how to move my character and what my character needs to do and how they need to be dressed. And then they need to have that learning experience, not once, but not twice, but several times, to really help with that. And if we create challenges and we add groups, they're always going to be solving the challenge differently in a different direction, and that's going to keep it fresh, new, and engaging. Embed the use of virtual worlds as a natural part of your curriculum. Tell the learners what you're going to learn in a virtual world, have them experience the virtual world, and then debrief them on that experience. And remember that virtual worlds can influence people to behave in a pro-social manner. So set up the virtual world to mimic the behavior you want in the physical world. Or as my friend Tony O'Driscoll calls it, the meat world, right? The virtual world and the meat world. Set things up so that what the behavior you're doing in the virtual world is the behavior you want in the meat world, or I like physical world better. And then finally, engagement is what leads to learning. So make sure there's engagement so that people actually learn. Yeah, meat space, Merlin, thank you. So that there's engagement, and engagement is what leads to learning. So that's the presentation that I had for tonight. I want to thank everyone for attending. This has been a great experience for me, and I really enjoy talking to everyone about this, and I think it's a subject that really is important as we think about the future of learning, which I believe is definitely around virtual worlds and gamification. So now I think I have a little bit of time for some questions. So if anybody has a question, I'd be more than delighted to answer the question. Okay, I see lots of people have lots of questions.
Yeah, there's one question that came up right there. I don't know if you can see it, Karl, but let me read it to you. It says, how does the amount of time spent by the learner to achieve a significant learning objective in a virtual world gamified setting compares to the time required for didactic instruction? So how does it differ, the time differ for the instructor and designer?
Okay, so that's a really good question. So let me answer that in a couple ways. One, at first I thought the question was, how does the time differ for the learner? And in my experience, a lot of times didactic information, you know it for the test, the next day or the next 2 days, but you don't know it forever. So if you want to teach to the test, don't use an interactive, gamified virtual experience, because that is deeper learning, takes a little bit longer, but lasts longer. Now, to be honest, setting up the virtual experience for the designer or the instructor to be highly interactive and highly engaging will take a little bit more time up front, especially because it's not a way that people are used to. But once you set it up, it actually takes less time to facilitate, because you're not talking the whole time. You're not directing the whole time. You simply set up a situation, and then you set up elements for reflection, elements for activities, elements for engagement. So I always say that it's about a 20% to 30% higher design time frame than a didactic lecture. But the learning, I believe, is 80 to 90% higher than the didactic instructional situation. So it kind of depends on what your outcomes are. If you really want the people to learn something deeply and richly, spending a little bit more time to set that up, it's just like, setting up a real world, a meat space field trip, right? You got to call to get permissions. You got to call the place where you're doing the field trip. You got to tell the field trip people what your learning objectives are. You got to ship the students to that experience. Then you have the debrief. Same thing, but that experience, that field trip, stays with students literally for years and years and years. Same thing with a virtual interactive experience. So I say yes, it does take a little bit longer, but I believe that the learning outcome will be a little bit higher.
Thank you, Karl. Let's take one more question. There were 3 related questions that kind of popped up on chat. Let me see if I can kind of combine them for you. They're all related to the meta-analysis that you quoted in your presentation, such as what were the inclusion criteria, the categories, and the limitations. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, I actually quoted from several meta-analyses. So the one by Tracy Sitzman, it's 65 studies. she looked at a combination of, she believed that games and simulations were very similar, so she combined games and simulations into one category. She was looking at adult learners, not children, so the age was 18 years and older. She was looking at a corporate setting, not academic setting, so that was what she looked at. The other one by Wooters was 39 studies done since the Sitzman study, and Wooters looked at adults as well, found lots of similarities. One interesting thing that Wooters did find was that learners 41 years of age and older did not seem to learn as much as those who were younger. So that I thought was kind of an interesting finding by Wooters. They also found, interestingly, that even though games led to higher learning, didn't necessarily mean higher motivation. And I think one of the mistakes lots of people make is they believe because it's a game or gamified, everybody will love it. And not everybody loves games. Not everybody loves lectures. Not everybody loves virtual worlds. Not everybody loves discussions. So any instructional method is not going to meet the requirements of everybody. That's naive to think that. But Wooters kind of highlights that the games aren't necessarily more motivational, but they are more instructional. And Sitzman also found that in order for learning to occur, the learner doesn't need to indicate that they had fun. So fun isn't what makes gamified experiences effective. It's the interactivity that makes a gamified experience effective. But if you look up my slides they're on my blog, and both of them have the quote citations. So if you really want to dig deep into those articles and find the flaws in the research and the mistakes in the research and find out what really the research says, you can do that on your own independently and check it out. And you may have the same conclusions as I do or different conclusions, but certainly they're out there in the public domain so that you can take a look.
Thank you very much, Karl, for coming. We have about 3 minutes for our next session, but that was wonderful information, everyone. Please show our appreciation to Karl. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. It was my pleasure.